non-religious but nationalistic sources. But there are also problems with Islamic law. There are problems directly coming from what we call Islamic law. And in my book, I try to put those problems in basic three, broad categories. One is what I call the imposition of piety, like a religious police telling you to put your headscarf on, or the religious police telling you to pray, or not to drink alcohol and punishes you if you do so. That's the imposition of piety. A second problem is the ban on apostasy. Again, the ban that tells you that you cannot change your religion for another religion. You cannot change it. Of course, they allow changing from Christianity to Islam, but if you want to do it the other way around, that's not allowed. And there's the ban on blasphemy, which is any disrespectful or critical approach against what is accepted as the Islamic norm. Now, these bans certainly come from Islamic law, or in other words, the Sharia. And I will say a few things about Sharia, but let me first say this. There's an interesting fact about the Sharia. I know it's not a very popular concept in the West right now, the term the Sharia, and for understandable reasons, for reasons that I mentioned also, like corporal punishments, like stoning and so on. But there's this curious pattern. In the West, Sharia is a very scandalous term. I mean, it's seen as a problem, and Westerners always think, how can we avoid countries based on Sharia in the Middle East? But when you go to the Middle East, Sharia is quite respected. When you go to Islamic countries, very secular people might be disturbed about the concept, but it's a very respected, word if you even utter the words Sharia. And the parties who advocate Sharia often become quite popular. Now, is it because that just Muslim societies have some inherent love for corporal punishments, or is it that, or is there another reason? I would say, I think we should understand this question. And one Western thinker who digged this issue a little bit, and I think who got it right, was Noah Feldman from Harvard University. He's a professor of law there. He realized that historically, Sharia meant for Muslims what is in the West called the rule of law. And here's why. When you look at what the Sharia is, what's the definition, the standard definition you'll get in any dictionary, and which is right, is Islamic law developed by scholars according to Quran and the life of Prophet Muhammad and his example. Now, it is important that it's those scholars who developed the Sharia, not the state, not the political authority. That's why most of the time the Sharia actually acted as a constraint on political power, arbitrary political power. And that's why for centuries in the Muslim world, the Sharia was what protected the people from oppressive rulers. There are many examples of this. For example, when the sultans wanted to overtax their population, the Sharia was what would ban them, from doing that. In the 14th century, that's why the Muslim ruler Al-Hilji is known to have complained that when he wanted to overtax his Hindu subjects, his top scholar, whose job was to oversee the state according to Sharia, said, no, you cannot do this. And he complained, whenever I want to consolidate my rule, someone tells me that this is against the Sharia. In the Ottoman Empire, the ninth Sultan, Yavuz the Grim, he actually wanted to forcibly convert all Christians into Islam. And it was his top scholar who said, Shaykhul Islam, whose job was again to oversee the state according to Sharia, said, no, you cannot do this because Christians have the right to practice under Islamic law. So examples like this explain you why, again, in the Ottoman Empire, people would march to the palace if the Sultan did something terribly unjust, chanting, we want Sharia. So that's why this has been the basic idea of law, justice against an oppressive ruler in the Islamic civilization. And that's, I think, why we should understand Sharia in a way that understanding why it is popular in the Muslim world. But, so in other words, instead of expecting from Muslims to denounce the Sharia, we should expect from them to reform it. We should expect from them to look at the authoritarian elements there and question their origins and reform the perspective. I think that's a better approach. I mean, it will be, instead of expecting them to denounce something which is, respectable in their tradition. And that's why I try to do, actually, in the book, by looking at these oppressive, coercive elements in the Sharia. The imposition of piety, the ban on apostasy, and the ban on blasphemy. And there are other elements too, but these are, I think, the basic categories. And of course, there's the issue of corporal punishments, like lashes and all those things. And again, it will be, I think, important to put that in historical perspective. In 7th century Arabia, in which the Quran was revealed and the Sharia began to take hold, there were no correctional facilities. I mean, you need a real state to employ a prison and guards around it. So at the time, all punishments in that milieu was corporal. So that's why understandable why it was that in the beginning. But the problem is that when Muslims do want to keep that as it is, literally today, without reforming it, without adopting it to changing circumstances. Now, about these three subjects, these three main authoritarian categories in the Sharia, what should we say? Well, first of all, the very important thing to say is that none of them are in the Quran. Actually, much of Sharia is not in the Quran. The Quran, the only undisputed source of Islam, brings broad principles on many issues. It doesn't go into details. It speaks about justice. It speaks mostly about theological issues, but there are on earthly issues. It speaks of general principles, but it doesn't put many detailed rules. And those rules were developed by scholars in the Middle Ages according to the concepts of the time. Take this issue of apostasy, the most important issue today probably when it comes to religious freedom. There is no verse in the Quran which brings an earthly punishment of apostasy. Well, there are verses saying that apostates will be punished in afterlife by God, but that's in the afterlife. That's not on this world. So it depends on God to whom to punish in heaven or hell, or punish or reward people. But the Quran simply brings no earthly punishment. Actually, there are verses in the Quran which confirm that people should be free to choose their religion. The famous verse, there's no compulsion in religion. There's another verse which says, the truth is from God. Let anyone who want to believe it, believe it. Let anyone who want to disbelieve it, disbelieve it. There's another verse which shows that at the time of the Quran, at the time of the revelation of the Quran, people could go back and forth between Islam and disbelief. It says those who first believe and then disbelieve and then believe and then disbelieve again and then remain in disbelief will be punished in afterlife. But it shows that politically you could change your religion in the early decades of Islam. But where does this then ban on apostasy come from? Well, it comes from, like many other issues in the Sharia, from post-Quranic sources, from sources that are interpretations of the Prophet's example. They are called the hadiths, and also from the consideration of medieval scholars. There's a saying attributed to Prophet Muhammad which says, kill someone who changes his religion. Quite bold in that, which I find contradictory to the Quran, but many Muslims take as the way to follow. But when you look at when did this hadith emerge, and in which context it emerged, you actually come in a very interesting position. There are scholars who studied this, and I don't want to go into all the details about Islamic law there. But this hadith emerged in a context where Muslims thought anybody who leaves the Muslim community will join the enemy army that they're fighting. In other words, this was seen as a political treason to the political community. That's why, for example, the Hanafi school, one of the Sunni schools in Islam, the more flexible generally, thought that apostasy should be punished only for males and not the females, because they thought females will not be a threat, but the males will be a soldier, fighting against the Muslim army. In other words, this had a context in which, it emerged out of a war context. But it's not Quranic, and it means it's a historical, it's just an interpretation of the political context by medieval scholars, and it means that there is no need for Muslims to uphold this idea today. But there's a need for them to change this, because if you basically say in the modern world, well, we are a religion which is free to join but not free to leave, then you're really not making a very principled stance on religious freedom. When I debate this question with fellow Muslims, I say, well, what do you think if there was a law in the United States which said anybody who leaves Christianity for Islam will be given 3 days to recant and then executed. Well, they find it shocking. So I think it is shocking the other way around, and that's why I think these elements in Islamic law, which are actually not Quranic, which are not even divinely mandated from an Islamic perspective, should be changed, because simply it harms innocent people, and it also shows Islam as an intolerant religion, which is really not confident in its own truths. Because if you're confident in your truths, you probably will not try to impose them. You would rather try to share them with people. And I can say in other issues too, on the issue of blasphemy, again, there is no verse in the Quran which says any blasphemous talk should be punished by force. And especially this is relevant when it comes to the issue of mockery, a particular verse. Because mockery has been a big issue. There has been cartoons in Europe, cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. Well, I didn't like those cartoons personally. I thought it would be politer if they didn't do those cartoons. As I don't like cartoons making fun of Jesus Christ or Abraham or God, the Most High, of course. But what should we do in the face? If someone is not that polite and makes a cartoon mocking your faith, what should you do? Again, the Islamic militant answer is, well, you do something against them violently. Well, again, when you look in the Quran, you see nothing like that. There's actually only one Quranic verse which clearly addresses this issue, and it says, when you hear God's mercies being mocked, just do not sit with those people unless they engage in a different conversation. So, not sitting with people who are rude is, I think, a universally accepted principle. So, based on that verse, I think Muslims can develop a policy of refusing to join talks or conversations, or maybe buying newspapers which mock their faith. But that is very, very different from, again, that would be a civilized form of boycott of a hostile rhetoric than attacking it or trying to punish it. Of course,